Back in 1980, China made international headlines when it imposed its one-child policy. The broader population growth initiative wasn't short of any controversy and criticism. Since then, 43 years have passed. And a completely new crisis is haunting Xi Jinping. By all accounts, China's population is vanishing. For the raging economy, this is a nightmare. So, how does this crisis unfold? Well, let's start. China's population planning program has always been a mess. The government started with a harsh policy of limiting families to one child and then gradually loosened the restrictions. After the one-child policy, the state introduced the two-child policy and so on. Now there's no limit on the family size. Doesn't it make you wonder why a country as authoritative as China would introduce drastic reforms like these? Clearly, it wasn't just about the will of the people. Before Beijing finally reversed its policy in 2021, the Chinese population had protested against the population planning program for years. But that never worked out. If anything, certain ethnic minorities started to face population decline, and women were finding it increasingly difficult to manage unplanned pregnancies and unwanted abortions. So, for China to change its policy, something must have happened, right? Well, this is just not a hunch. For all we know, the population crisis in China has been brewing for the past 3 years. But, of course, the news never made any rounds in public or international media. Until a whistleblower and investigative report started to whisper about something surprising. The most populated country isn't the most populated country after all. Times have changed drastically, and today, it's India that stands on the top of the population podium. In 1961, China faced a devastating famine. Within a year, its population decreased by 1%. The country quickly recovered as the population grew by 2% annually in the following years. But now, after 6 decades, the country has seen a hard-to-ignore decline in population. In fact, it's just not a halt in the growing population. Nope. It's something worse than that. Think in terms of a very bleak future and China's economy slowly dying due to decreased manpower. Sure, seems unimaginable at this point, but this is not a thing of the distant future or some economic forecast. This is Xi Jinping's worst nightmare, the one he's living in a loop. For the first time in 6 decades, China is living in an era of negative population growth. On top of it, the demographic crisis just got worse. In 2022, there was a decrease of 850,000 people from the overall population of 1.41175 billion. On the outlook, this might not seem like a dangerous toll on people. After all, the country has a historical legacy of resource mismanagement and never-ending cycles of poverty. What you need to consider is that this is just the start of a big problem, and the UN experts are very on board with this prediction. The same experts believe that by 2050, China would lose 109 million people off its population. So, where does this problem originate from? Well, even though the one-child policy was reversed ages ago, its impact is still present in Chinese society. Women simply refuse to have children. That's not a conscious decision. Yet the typical culture of childbearing and upbringing was largely eroded during the one-child policy implementation. Even then, women were left to raise the child alone, while the father went out to earn livelihood for the family. There's no care economy to raise children. At the end of the day, every burden falls on women, who are also part of the Chinese labor force. And the attitude isn't exactly susceptible to change. When the news of population degrowth became a top trend on social media in China, the reaction of netizens was rather shocking. To put it very simply, many people just don't care. The top trend was to discuss if you really need a child to live a balanced and spiritual lifestyle. Plus, in hard times, no one really wants to allocate their salaries into raising children. And it makes all the sense in the world, right? Not to mention, China isn't exactly in their post-COVID timeline. For the past 3 years, zero-COVID policy has trapped families in their homes. How do you even begin to think about bringing a child into a very uncertain future? There are hardly any marriages, and the resources are running thin. The government isn't compensating for the lost wages of its quarantined labor force. Sure, you'll get occasional meals to survive, but that's just about it. It's obvious that Xi Jinping isn't blind to these growing trends and pressing concerns. For him and the Chinese Communist Party, the country's evolving economy is their saving grace. So it makes a lot of sense why their response was quick and swift. That, of course, doesn't mean that the results are going to be everything that the state wants. Then what is the CCP doing? On a very local level, the government has taken up initiatives like giving housing subsidies to new families, providing longer maternity leaves, and deduction of taxes for parents. Against the backdrop of hard COVID policies and the one-child culture, these concessions don't seem very effective. What the government fails to recognize might seem very obvious to you. The problem isn't just with a lack of government support. The border issue is with the culture. In all fairness, people don't want to have children because they don't see any inherent value in it. On the flip side, that's perhaps the worst news for the looming economy of China. Besides the waves of automation, the entire industrial sector relies on growing labor supply to meet increasing demand. And where does this supply of labor come from? Well, at the very core, any economy's biggest source of manpower is its population and stable fertility rates. To achieve any of that, you don't want your demographic to be over-masculine. To add on to Beijing's trouble, that's exactly the problem with China's population. By all means, the country is going through a demographic crisis, and every finger points towards the residual of one-child policy. That isn't surprising at all. When Chinese families only had the choice to bear one child, the general trend showed that boys were preferred over girls. The preferential treatment is closely associated with the large acceptance of men as the sole breadwinners. In many cases, women would find that they're having a girl in the mid-stages of pregnancy and would get an abortion. Now everything has backfired severely. It's actually the gender imbalance that would take China to its economic downfall. After all, you need women to add on to your population, right? As of now, China has 690 million females as compared to 722 million males. If those numbers don't sound alarming to you, let's refresh some of our earlier discussions. Here's the thing, the shrinking population isn't the only unchanged factor here. The traditional preference of boys over girls isn't changing either. So if anything, the demographic crisis is far worse for the women in China. That could be the tipping point of the population crisis. How this issue pans out in the future is going to have deep implications all over the world. You heard that right. Something that's quite specific to China is going to paralyze the world's economic system. And the biggest pitfall is going to be inflation. This might sound like an exaggeration or even a fetch, but even a very small insight into how the trade systems work will tell you otherwise. For the most part, the US and other parts of Europe heavily rely on Chinese imports, including the day-to-day consumption of basic products. China is known to mass-produce products because it has cheap labor, and that labor is in abundance, and they're fast. The global chain of supply and demand depends on this very fragile dynamic. See that iPhone in your own hand? There's no doubt that it's American-designed, but a complex in Xinjiang in China assembled it for you. If China's labor supply simply vanishes or isn't replaced, the consumption in developed nations might also collapse. A new iPhone produced in the US is going to be much more costly due to robust labor laws and its limited supply. So, in that case, bringing manufacturing back home is going to cause inflation. The added costs to produce your favorite products are going to be huge. Within China itself, a large chunk of industries might have to face permanent closure because there isn't going to be any labor supply to support them. The starting point of an impending global crisis can be traced to one country's mismanaged population control. Who knows? Families in China refusing to have children is pushing us towards economic demise. Did you love this video? Well, give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more interesting content like this.